So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce tonight Davina Hachgenei, my former colleague. And we worked together for a couple of years on Scottish history from different perspectives. Yeah, Davina is developed in this time into an expert of actual literature methodology from the literature science. She applied narratology and close reading to the most important Scottish chroniclers, John Barbour and Scott, of course. And yeah, this led to a very successful PhD project that was finished in 2019. Up and until now, her PhD is unfortunately only available in German, but it is open source. You can put the link in the chat. One sec. So everybody who's able to read it, go ahead and do it. You will learn a lot about the various chronicles in Scotland and the background information, and it's also, of course, written for a German audience. Yeah, and after that, Davina developed into coordination and research management, basically at the presidency of Mainz University, where she is still active, or what is her current occupation. And now we are gathered here to learn more about the scientific achievements and how the application of narratology to a classical historical source, such as an chronicle, worked out. So the floor is yours, and we are happy to get some insights into your results.
Thank you, Matthias. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for the invitation overall. I'm very happy to be able to do research or to talk about my research once again. So for several years now, I'm working as a project lead in organizational development. So I'm not doing research anymore. So I was very happy to take this trip down memory lane once again. So yes, if you like, read my PhD. You can see a lot of things you should do and a lot of things, I think even more, you shouldn't do in a PhD thesis in that book. Yes, you can see the presentation. I never stopped sharing, as I realize now. Do you see something? Yeah.
Yes, we do.
I named, or I titled this paper Targeting Nation, a narratological analysis of the Scotichronicon and the proofs. And I'm talking about these two books to different extents, the Scotichronicon and the proofs. They are both texts which are classics of Scottish historical writing and research. The Scotichronicon goes by the catchword of national treasure, and Susan Foran calls the proofs the most important instance for Scottish historical writing. So it's the foundation narrative of Scotland. Barbour's The Proofs is the only work of the early reigns of it's the only work on the early reign of Robert Bruce, and it's he is arguably the most famous Scottish king of the Middle Ages, and he's the hero of Scottish independence. And the manuscript, or there are only two surviving late manuscripts of that book. What both works, the Scotichronicon and the proofs, have in common is that they are the only narrative sources for the period or parts of the period they describe. And this is the reason why they are used by historians to reconstruct the history of the events for the respective periods. This also led to the fact that large parts of the works have been exclusively read. this only led to the fact that the works that has been produced since that time focus solely on those two works as source bases. So when you want to reconstruct what Robert Bruce did, you look into the works of Bruce and you use that as your source basis. Although both texts differ significantly in their formal design, they are used as sources for historical research. So Sergi Minor, for example, writes, quote, "The chronicles of John Forden, Walter Bauer, and Hector Boyce, and the romances of Barbour and Harry recreated overtly, as the Scottish Arthurian and Alexander romances did more implicitly, the Scottish past, establishing a conception of nationhood which set the basis for later developments of Scottishness until the present day." The prose was written around 1375 in Scots and in verse. The Scotichronicon, on the other hand, is a chronicle, and it's written mainly in Latin prose, and it was compiled in the 1440s. And despite these obvious differences in design, current research ascribes the same textual function to both works. They both are considered historiographical texts whose textual function is to postulate and further promote the unity of Scotland. The focus is on the establishment or stabilization of the Scottish kingdom, above all in demarcation from its English neighbours. The Scottish Wars of Independence are seen as a catalyst for this development. I think that all this is not really looking into the more faceted character of both works, and there a narratological analysis should begin and lead to the respective text not only being interpreted against those background of as I think more currently pre-given horizon of interest. Exactly. So the works are being interpreted before the background of the currently pre-given horizon of Scots' aspirations for independence and a certain Anglophobia. And I want them to be understood as multifaceted products of that time and a form of coping with contingency. So now, now let's look into what we will see today. Today we will look at the analysis of the what I call macro structure of the prose and a narratological analysis of one chapter of the Scotichronicon. And I hope that this will give you an understanding of whether or not the texts in question are targeting nation. As I said, the prose, John Barbour's work, which is today referred to as the prose, was written in 1375, and it recounts the events following the death of Alexander III of Scotland in 1286. And it covers the time period until the death of the Guardian Thomas Randolph in 1332. The term events in this context, however, can be specifically defined as martial activities. Other storylines such as courtly love or courtly life are non-existent. The focus of the narrative is on the fighting men and their deeds of chivalry. So the work has been described by scholars as a romance, a poem, history, a chronicle, a pseudo-chronicle, a biography, a pseudo-biography, and much more. And its passage on freedom, I think, is well known today. All freedom is a noble thing, it begins. Around 1445, so some 70 years later, Walter Bauer's Scotichronicon was written. It's a completely different text, and it can be easily be classified as a chronicle. And it consists of a total of 16 books, and it covers the period from the exodus of the Jews from Egypt, which was around 1500 BC. And it covers a period until the death of James I in 1437. It is thematically dealing mainly with events that took place in Scotland or have a thematic connection to Scotland. So even the Exodus is thematically linked to Scotland in that it introduces the origogentis of the Scots into the narrative. I don't know if this is common knowledge, but the Scots derive from Egyptian princess, so the daughter of the pharaoh named Scota, and a Scythian prince named Gaithalos. So they are the parents of the Scots nation. So the basic assumption behind my whole approach is that every text has at least one intended function, so one function that the author really intended when he wrote his text or his book, his work. I call this text function. It's the text function of the text. So I think that this text function can be determined through methodological reception. And to do so, I do examine the materiality of the text, so the text as an artifact really, the content and the form in question, which I call the analysis of the macro structure. And also I analyze the microstructure by means of the narratology of the narratological terms of Gerard Genette. And the analysis of the macrostructure is then complemented by the classical narratological examination of the content, which focuses on the linguistic and structural composition of the work, such as tempus, mode, and voice. The results of the study of the microstructure in interaction with the overall analysis of the macro structure should help to determine the function of the text and to place the works in a context of use and in a historical cultural context. And I think this is very this is the key, I think, to understanding how and why the texts were written and how this method works and what the merits of such a method are, namely in their ability to establish the connection to the time they were written in and to establish the context of use and to place them into the historical cultural context they were written in. This really is key to understanding why one should do such a thing. Let's now look into example number 1, the macro structure of the proofs. There are today 2 manuscripts of the proofs preserved, and both were written in late 15th century, so roughly about 100 years after the work was written by John Barbour. I worked with the Edinburgh manuscript, which dates to 1489, and I try now to show you, yes, this one it is. Let's see if we can make this larger. So this is the original, or not the original, this is the manuscript from Edinburgh, and you get an impression of how it looks like. What it looks like. Yes, exactly. Let's see how we can get back to the presentation. We can take a look into this later on again. It is written on paper, the manuscript is written on paper, and none of the existing manuscripts, so neither the MSE or MSc, contain a table of contents or indexes. The text is nevertheless divided into sections by indenting the first 2 lines, and some of the text is accompanied and commented on by rubrics in the side margins. However, all this does not indicate that the sections of the text were meant to be read independently. So even though these rubrics structure the content of the book to a certain extent. They break off after half of the text, so halfway through. They also were partially cut off at some point, so that suggests that they lost their function or were no longer considered relevant. The structure of the narrative and the formal arrangement suggests that the book, so the prose as a narrative, should be received coherently, so in one part from beginning to end. So therefore, it was not necessary to include a table of contents with corresponding chapter headings, nor did it seem necessary to distinguish the chapters more clearly from one another, or even to introduce a structure similar to chapters. And you might think that this is not very important to say that a book is intended to be read from beginning to end, because that's the way we normally read books. But if you compare this to the use of a chronicle, for example, where you want to know only one specific chapter, you want to know how the coronation of Alexander III happened. Was there an ointment or wasn't there? Was there a coronation stone? What exactly happened? Then you would look it up in the index and browse to the specific chapter and only read that chapter. So for the prose, we can say that at least with the manuscripts that we have at hand, it was not the way that the use was intended. So you should read it from beginning to end, because it would be really hard just to find that one specific passage you are looking for in a book that looks like this. So you get my point, I hope. Like many other medieval texts, and as I already said, the text today referred to as the prose has no contemporary title. The majority of events feature Western magnates and take place in the west of Scotland. The narrative begins with a prelude to the death of Alexander III, and the entire first part is described in a very time-lapse manner, which leads to the fact that you might think that Robert Bruce, the competitor, is the same person as Robert Bruce, the king, when in fact the competitor is the grandfather of the later King Robert the Bruce, the first king of Scotland named Robert. So the way in which the story is depicted makes you think that it's only one person, when once you know the history of events, you know that in fact there are two persons. So the narrative ends 3 years after the death of Robert Bruce, who died in 1329. And that lets me think, if the book The Prose was a pseudo-biography or a biography, the narrative should begin with his introduction and it should end with his death. Additionally, the narrative focuses in the opening passage is clearly on James Douglas. And although the competitor, Bruce the competitor, is mentioned first, the introduction remains a mere mention. And in contrast, the introduction of James Douglas is very vivid. It's described very detailed. His parentage, his youth, his upbringing, his character, his appearance, his motivations are all discussed lengthy in the introduction. And there's also a unique comparison of Douglas to Hector of Troy. And all these details are completely absent from Robert Bruce and the other characters. So I think it's safe to say that the book today called The Prose is not really about Robert the Bruce only. So if the central theme was Scottish independence, I think that the story would have to end in 1314 after the Battle of Bannockburn, which was a great victory for the Scottish, or for some of the Scots, for at least for the Bruce Scots, not so much for the Balliol Scots. So, but then it should have latest ended with the Peace Treaty of Northampton in 1328, which led to the de facto recognition of Robert Bruce as a king, and the recognition of the independence of the country by the English. Plus, additionally, this was 1 year before Robert Bruce died. So this would have been the perfect ending, I think, for a book about Robert the Bruce, and would have been the perfect ending for the story about Scottish independence or Scotland. But then again, the book didn't stop there. Apart from the very brief passage in praise of freedom, freedom is a noble thing, which is itself open to interpretation, as the 25 lines in praise of freedom are directly followed by 25 lines about how bad it is to be married, and that this really is worse than serfdom, so never get married. This is open to interpretation, and despite this one passage, you never hear about freedom or independence during the rest of the book. So I think this is not the guiding theme of the Bruce. What does it then offer you as a topic or a general theme? What all the protagonists have in common is that they are fighters. And what all the episodes have in common is that they depict combat. So according to what the author writes in his prologue, that he wants to report on the deeds of heroic men, this is what you can find. And it's only that 2 of those men are Douglas and Robert Bruce. So, oh no, I think I skipped one. So the Bruce is written in Scots, and it's written in verse. So at this time, or at the time the text was written, Scots was one of the languages spoken in Scotland. At least in theory, this allowed it to be received by larger sections of the population, and it ensured that the audience or the individual reader could receive the work directly orally and without the need for an additional stage of translation. However, Scots was only one of the national languages in the northwest of the country, and on the islands, the majority of the population still or spoke Gaelic and Norwegian in the northeast. Nevertheless, through the use of the vernacular in combination with the specific metric Barbour uses, he brings his work close to the English and Scottish metrical romances, which were written from the 13th to the early 16th century. And thematically, those novels dealt with heroic and chivalrous deeds, just like the Bruce, of men who fight, but in these novels they fight patrons, villains, or more fictitious opponents as dragons or giants. And another central motif in these books is courtly love. And even if there is some proximity linguistically and formally, those motives are completely absent in the Bruce. So this is what you would analyze roughly in an analysis of the microstructure. So what is the manuscript looking like? What content is this? What starting point? And what is the form? And how can you put this into context with each other? What does it tell you? So the interpretation for me is that the analysis of the formal and content-related structure of the work leads to the conclusion that the intended audience must have been noblemen, and that these noblemen probably are based in the southwest of the country, and that they are the new elite of the country. The narrow thematic focus further reduces the group of addressees, since not all Scottish nobles found themselves in this narrative or could show their approval to Barbour's account of events. Excluded was, for example, the entire group of the so-called disinherited, who were dispossessed as supporters and defenders of the Balliol dynasty after they lost the Battle of Bannockburn together with the English. So the Prose is designed as a work for the country's new elite who were able to establish themselves as elite because their forebears shared battles with Robert Bruce and were loyal to the Bruce dynasty. And it's not only the high nobility that finds consideration in the narrative, it's also the members of the lower nobility, the so-called gentry, who at that time established themselves as a new socio-economic class. And in that regard, they used the Romans as a powerful vehicle for expressing and exploring the unique and emergent socioeconomic identity, as has been stated. The deeds of the ancestors are not primarily recounted in the Prose for the sake of memoria. Rather, the narrative is told in the sense of a present and future-oriented program, in the way that the Prose shows the winners and losers of the wars of independence, which is directly linked to the actions of the persons. So by using the vernacular in combination with the metric verse, the author deliberately adopts the style of the Old English or Germanic heroic epics. But the innovative element of the Prose lies in the idea of presenting an almost contemporary topic in this antique form. And the result is a work that draws structurally and formally on biblical narrative, classical antiquity, and the vernacular oral heroic tradition. And I think it's very striking that the combination of old and new, tradition and innovation is a reflection on the historical social conditions of the time in which the Prose was written. In 1375, when Barbour wrote the work, the Pruse dynasty had already failed. I don't know if you have that in mind. After only 2 generations, so Robert II was the first king of the Stuart dynasty, and he had his power base and main supporters in Western Scotland. He succeeded to the throne in 1371, and at the time being, 1375, it remained to be seen whether or not the dynasty would succeed or whether or not civil war would break out once again, as it had in 1292. Also, during this time, the battles with England intensified. And in this respect, I think that the work could have had a stabilizing effect, and it may have legitimized the reigning dynasty. It surely celebrated the dynasty's origins in Western Scotland and at the same time emphasized the role of the nobility and the gentry, using the example of past history. Up to date, the work's strong focus on the southwest of the country is often explained by the assumption that Barbour may have come from there, which is not sure. What the textual analysis proposes is that the work that can be directly be linked to the person and reign of Robert II, Stuart King, is focused on those regions because this is the power base of Robert II. Central areas of Kyle Stuart, Carrick, and Ayrshire were the heartland of the Stuarts. And these are the areas where Scotland II had the greatest influence and the greatest support in the beginning of his reign. Another fact is that up to today, the majority of historians state that Robert II was not interested in war. He was not interested in chivalry. He was not interested in all the knightly deeds. It was something he was simply not interested in. War and warfare did not play a role, were not important for him. It's only with Aberdeen's scholar Alistair MacDonald's research that we learn that the period after the truce, 1369, was one of successive rearmament and reconquest of the territories occupied by the English. And I think this is certainly reflected in the ideological program of the Bruce, as the narratological analysis showed. So I think this is the first breaking point, because we now stop looking into the Bruce, and I would switch over to the Scotichronicon. I don't know whether or not we should make a break here and start a discussion about what we heard so far, or whether I should go on with my second example, which will be quite different. So any opinions on that? So, okay, I go on.
The chair decides.
The chair decides. 1 second, I'm just we could decide that with raised hands. So any questions about the Bruce so far?
So just let me go on then. You take a deep breath.
Wait a second.
Just go on.
People need some time to press the button, but it seems not to be the case. Okay, then please go on, and then we're gathering the questions at the end of the session. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So, okay, that's one thing I did in my PhD, was analyzing the macro structure, the creator content of the work, and try to find out what is the text function and why did the author write this book in the first place. I did this for the Scotichronicon as well, and this is quite interesting, but it's only one part of what I did. I complemented those analysis with the analysis of the what I call microstructure, and this is a classical narratological analysis of the text. I don't know, some of you may have done this in schools. So you look at the text and you see who's the narrator, what is the voice, where's direct speech, where's the indirect speech, things like that. And I show you here a picture of what I have done. So I read the text and I just you can see here narrative speech and analysis, stuff like this. And so I read all the books, so it was quite interesting. Exactly. Let's now take a look at one of my all-time favorite chapters in Scotichronicon. It always is a great laugh when you're in Scotland and are working through this chapter, because it's about a verbal exchange between a Scottish knight and an English knight. Because due to the time and the lack of time, let's today only look into the different forms of speech and not what one could do anyways with a narratological analysis. The way in which speech is depicted has an influence on the reader's perception. And according to Jeanette, it is through speech that the narrated situation can seem more or less distant, and this is to say more or less mimetic. So this state is fluently, and this is shown here by the usage of a scale going from maximal mimetic on one hand to maximal diegetic on the other. The direct reported speech is the most mimetic sort of speech, and the narrated speech the most diegetic. So that means you can just simply state the knight is brave. This would be a narrated speech, so the author or the voice just says the knight is brave, or the author could tell a story where the knight fights against a dragon, and then the reader himself would realize, gosh, that is really a brave knight. And that would be the mimetic depiction of the situation. So the less mediation there is between author and recipient, the more immediate and visual the representation appears to be, and the more mimetic it seems. This can be graded by the insertion of inquit formulae, as they interrupt the stream of speech and thereby remind the reader of the only alleged state of speech. Additionally, the formula can be used to describe the quality of the speech. For example, he whispered, he shouted, or he burst out. And this is what I applied to the chapter of Barbour's Scotichronicon, book 15, chapter 5. You see here that I added the information in the margin. So, a story of a knight's artfulness, which is in the Latin original named the De Narratione et Truffa Militari. The day after this triumphal victory, the Earl of Crawford was invited with his knights to dine with the Lord King of England. During a mutual exchange of views among the knights in the royal chamber after the meal, a certain grandiloquent English knight fell into conversation with a Scottish knight, Sir William de Diel, who was then in the presence of the Earl of Crawford along with various other knights. In the presence of many noble persons, both English and Scot, this man, among other things, burst out at Sir William in the following words. "I perceive, Scottish knight," he said, "that there are some spirited Scots among you, from whatever seed stock they spring, but you perhaps do know the origin of their magnanimity. Learn and understand for once, and when you return to your home country, have courage to say what you have learned from a truthful Englishman, namely what I am now going to say. It is certain," he said, "and it will not have escaped your recollection, that not long ago your unhappy province was carved up and conquered by noble Englishmen. At that time there were perhaps among you some fair and desirable young ladies, with whom some noble Englishmen of high birth and brave spirit had sexual relations, and fathered young branches growing from noble roots. Such a man perhaps is this Sir David of yours, whose bravery in combat is explained by his surname Lindsay, since he takes his name and stock from our people." On hearing this, the Englishmen standing around were moved to hearty laughter and praised the knight for his contribution. The Scottish knight begged for silence and a hearing, and thus began to speak. "This worthy knight has put together with sufficient oratorical skills words which are amiable and polished for eager ears. I say this to him by way of riposte, not denying that a large part of our land was lately carved up and occupied by contrivance of the English, but thanks to God it was not held by them for long. Also I acknowledge that then as now some fair and desirable women and young ladies have dwelt among us, and I also do not deny that gentlemen and magnates from England did then father on them some high-spirited and proud sons. But what are we to make of it? It is certain that while the English lords were staying in our kingdom, their various wives, from whom they had left at home, being delicate, cosseted, brought up for a life of leisure, and having time on their hands for pleasure, being deprived for too long of martial sexual relations, and not having the strength to contain themselves any more, but desiring new sexual partners, invited into the closest intimacy cooks and churls, serfs and villains, and sometimes friars and confessors. From these unions emerged, unless I am mistaken, men neither suited for warfare nor efficient at fighting battles. We rejoice therefore that we have arisen from your stock, and that we are born as gentlemen, while you from your stock have turned out degenerate." The Scot had not yet finished speaking when it happened that this verbal exchange between the two men came to the king's ears, and calling the knights before everyone, he made them repeat the conversation to him. He then rebuked the English knight sharply and praised the Scot for his answer with a splendid reward. So, what we can see in this chapter is, when we only look at the speech situations, is that the direct speech situations reveal the characters of the speakers. So in the present chapter, the English knight who remains nameless is, for all we know, he could be any or every English knight, and he is rude and has no manners. What we learn not only from the content of his speech, but also from the way in which his speech is described. He's not so much talking as he's bursting out. The Scottish knight, who is in the beginning named as Sir William de Diel, is later on only referred to as the Scot or the Scottish knight, and therefore could also be every Scottish knight. He behaves in a polite way, acts according to the rules of courtly culture and knighthood. The other English knights play a minor role in the story. They remain unnamed, and their function is only to provide for an imagined audience. Even the English king, who is unnamed, his function is to end the conflict and through his authority prevent a more stalwart quarrel, and to reward the Scottish knight. We know that the attention of the reader tends to focus on the seemingly closer parts of the narrated story, which are the direct reported speeches, and those of the Englishman is disrupted twice by inquit formula. That of the Scot is not interrupted once. Yes. The Scots message is marked as being central, and the message on the story level is very simple. A noble ancestry is more important than national origin, because it forms the basis for the ability of fighting, and more generally, it is the basis for chivalrous behavior. This is the key message of the chapter on the story level. But if one, I'm sorry, but if one puts it into context with the structure of the whole chapter, you will find that despite of what the Scot might say, namely that a noble ancestry is more important than national origin, the story only functions yet by the very antagonism of Scot versus Englishman. So there is in fact a difference between these two peoples, and the Scot is depicted as superior in every way. Also, in a wider context, this text reveals a more general understanding of one function of chronicles. It seems that the current chapter is not primarily concerned with the documenting or the recounting of some event of the past, as there are no dates given. It's concerned with the respective present, and there are no time references, there are no names mentioned, with the exception of Sir William de Diel, who himself transforms into a nameless Scot during the course of the story. And all this indicates that the chapter is not supposed to recount factual events of the past, but to be a timeless example of knighthood and chivalry, and Scottish knighthood and chivalry in particular. What else makes this chapter so special is the comparison between the interpretation of the two knight statements and the way in which they are expressed or depicted by the author. And that means that that is the contextualization of discourse and history. So what is said and in which way it is said. The content and form of the speech are reflected in each other in the form of an mise en abîme. So the knights discuss the foundations and conditions of chivalric behavior, and in discussing them, they display the behavior. Or in the case of the English knight, he does not display this behavior. So the Scot is the Scots behavior is marked by courtesy, chivalry, and manliness, as his origins might suggest. And the English knight is simply just rude. So, however, the author does not only reflect this in his narrative, but he also reflects this in the layout of this chapter, rather than simply just listing how a knight should behave and what qualities a knight should possess, and thus simply making a narrative statement. The author instead shows the reader. It's representation versus narration, showing versus telling. And that is very important because the reader has the possibility to make this knowledge his own. The formal structure of the chapter can thus fulfill both a didactic and a mnemonic function. In this way, the author demonstrates also his knowledge of rhetoric and the function of rhetoric. The structural design of the chapter is not an accidental product, but it's a result of a deliberate and conscious design of a trained author who consciously used the rhetorical means at his disposal to achieve a previously defined goal. So, targeting a nation. What are we to make of it? Are the Bruce and the Scotichronicon targeting nation? For the Bruce, I feel very comfortable to say no, the work does not target a Scottish nation. I'm very comfortable to say this is not one of the intended text functions of the author. There's simply just no room for something other than fighting. And it's very interesting because when you read the whole book, the genre which comes to mind, which would be the closest to what you find in the Bruce, is the chanson du geste, because it's just fighting, and it never stops. It's the only thing happened throughout the whole book. But what is missing is the notion of nation. There's just no such thing as fighting for Scotland. They are just fighting. For the Scotichronicon, the answer needs to be differentiated. So Scotland is the main topic of the work, yes. But it is interesting to note that the emphasis of the autonomy of the realm of Scotland seems not to be for the purpose of an external demarcation, but more for the internal consolidation of power. It was not primarily a matter of demarcation from the English, but of preventing Scottish nobility from collaborating with the English whenever it seems helpful to their causes. So to this end, Bauer invokes the unity of the country. Yes, he does. But it's not to prevent renewed English intervention. I think Bauer did not feel the realm of Scotland was questioned in a way that Stuart kingship could be questioned. So for him, Scotland is a given. There is nothing to prove behind that, in my opinion. So.
Okay.
I have another slide.
Okay.
Thank you for your attention.
Okay.